In a quiet corner of rural Texas where the land stretched wide and the skies seemed endless, there stood an old ranch that had been in Sarah Thompson's family for generations. The ranch was more than just a piece of property. It was a living, breathing part of Sarah's life. Every morning she would wake up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, sip coffee on the porch as the sun rose over the hills, and spend her days tending to her horses, cattle, and vegetable garden. It was simple, peaceful, and exactly how Sarah liked it. But one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. As Sarah stepped out onto her porch with her steaming mug of coffee, something unusual caught her eye. A white envelope tucked under the door. At first glance, it looked like any other piece of mail, but when she picked it up, her stomach sank. The return address read, Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Sarah frowned. Pine Ridge Estates? She had heard of it, of course. It was a fancy new housing development about a mile down the road, filled with cookie-cutter homes and manicured lawns. But what did they want with her? She didn't live in their neighborhood, nor had she ever interacted with anyone from the HOA. Curiosity turned into concern as she opened the letter and began reading. The tone of the letter was formal and cold, almost accusatory. It stated that Sarah's ranch was in violation of several HOA rules. Apparently her fencing wasn't up to code, her livestock were considered unauthorized, and her overall use of the land didn't comply with the community guidelines. The letter ended with a chilling ultimatum. Either Sarah vacated her property within 30 days or legal action would be taken against her. For a moment, Sarah simply stared at the paper in disbelief. Her hands trembled slightly as she reread the words, trying to make sense of them. Eviction? Rules? This was her land, her family's land. Her great-grandfather had bought it back in the early 1900s, long before Pine Ridge Estates even existed. How could some faceless organization claim authority over her home? Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what might have gone wrong. Had someone complained about her? Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Or worse, was it a scam? Determined to get answers, Sarah decided to pay a visit to the HOA office herself. The next day, after saddling her horse and riding through the familiar trails that led toward the development, Sarah arrived at Pine Ridge Estates. The contrast between her rustic ranch and the polished subdivision couldn't have been starker. Rows of identical houses lined perfectly paved streets, complete with ornamental lampposts and neatly trimmed hedges. Children played on playgrounds while sprinklers watered lush green lawns. It all felt so artificial compared to the untamed beauty of her ranch. At the center of the community stood the HOA's main building, a sleek modern structure surrounded by flower beds and stone pathways. Taking a deep breath, Sarah tied her horse to a nearby post and walked inside. The reception area smelled faintly of air freshener, and the walls were adorned with framed photos of smiling families posing in front of their pristine homes. When knocking, Sarah approached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard, looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm here about a letter your organization sent me." The receptionist nodded and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored suit appeared. He introduced himself as Richard Langley, the president of the HOA. His demeanor was confident, almost arrogant, as he shook Sarah's hand and motioned for her to follow him into a conference room. Once seated, Richard wasted no time getting to the point. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his voice smooth but condescending, "we've received reports that your property is not in compliance with our regulations. Now, I understand you may not be aware of these rules, but unfortunately, ignorance isn't an excuse." Sarah listened intently, her jaw tightening with each word. When Richard finished speaking, she leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Langley," she said evenly, "this is my family's land. We've owned it for decades, long before Pine Ridge Estates was even built. I don't know who told you otherwise, but I can assure you, I'm not going anywhere." Richard blinked, clearly taken aback by her assertiveness. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. Then, recovering his composure, he cleared his throat and said, "Well, Ms. Thompson, if that's the case, Perhaps we need to review the property records. Until then, however, I must remind you that failure to comply with our request will result in further action. As Sarah left the HOA office, her thoughts swirled with anger and frustration. Who did these people think they were? They couldn't just waltz in and try to take away her home. But beneath the outrage, another emotion bubbled to the surface: determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, Sarah was ready to give them one. Over the next few days, Sarah pored over every document related to her land. She dug out old deeds, tax records, and letters from previous owners. She visited the county courthouse, spending hours sifting through dusty archives until her fingers were black with ink. Slowly, but surely, she pieced together a timeline that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that her family had always owned the ranch, and that Pine Ridge Estates had made a massive mistake. What Sarah uncovered shocked her. Decades ago, when developers first planned the subdivision, they had assumed her ranch was part of the surrounding acreage. No one had bothered to double-check the boundaries, and somehow the error had gone unnoticed for years. Even more astonishing was the discovery that her family's original deed included a small parcel of land where the HOA's main office now stood. With this newfound knowledge, Sarah knew she had the upper hand. But she also knew that proving her case wouldn't be easy. The HOA was powerful, well-funded, and used to getting its way. Still, Sarah refused to back down. After all, this wasn't just about her. It was about justice, fairness, and protecting the legacy her ancestors had worked so hard to build. Little did Sarah know, her battle with the HOA was only beginning. What started as a simple misunderstanding would soon spiral into a full-blown feud, pitting her against an entire community, and testing her resolve in ways she never imagined. After her unsettling encounter with Richard Langley and the HOA, Sarah returned to her ranch feeling a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, but also a growing sense of determination. She knew she couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just about saving her home, it was about standing up for what was right. Her family had poured blood, sweat, and tears into this land for generations, and no group of strangers in suits was going to take that away from her. That night, as the stars twinkled above her ranch, Sarah sat at her kitchen table surrounded by piles of documents. Old deeds, faded maps, and yellowed letters lay scattered across the surface. She lit a lantern, its soft glow illuminating the room, and began sifting through everything she could find. Her great-grandfather's handwriting stared back at her on brittle paper, detailing the original purchase of the land. There were notes from her grandfather about boundary lines, receipts for property taxes paid year after year, and even a letter from a local historian confirming the Thompson family's long-standing ownership. But something still didn't add up. How had the HOA managed to overlook such a glaring mistake? Had they never checked the official records before building their fancy subdivision? Or was this some kind of deliberate oversight, a way to expand their territory without asking questions? The more Sarah thought about it, the angrier she became. It wasn't fair or legal for them to swoop in and try to claim what wasn't theirs. The next morning, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She loaded her truck with all the documents she'd gathered and drove into town to visit the county courthouse. The courthouse was an old brick building with creaky wooden floors and rows of filing cabinets stuffed with decades' worth of records. It smelled faintly of dust and ink, a place where history whispered from every corner. At first, the sheer volume of paperwork felt overwhelming. Sarah spent hours poring over ledgers, tracing the chain of title for her land back to the early 1900s. With each passing minute, her confidence grew. Every document she found reinforced what she already knew. Her family had owned the ranch since the beginning, but then something extraordinary caught her eye. A map from the 1920s that showed the exact boundaries of her property. As Sarah studied the map, her heart skipped a beat. Not only did it confirm the extent of her land, but it also revealed something she hadn't expected. A small parcel of her property, just a few acres, extended far enough to include the very spot where the HOA's main office now stood. Her jaw dropped as she realized the magnitude of this discovery. The HOA wasn't just trying to evict her from her ranch. Their entire operation was technically built on land that belonged to her. Sarah felt a surge of vindication wash over her. For days she'd been treated like an intruder, someone who didn't belong, but now, armed with irrefutable proof, she knew she held the upper hand. Still, she understood that winning this battle wouldn't be easy. The HOA wasn't going to admit defeat without a fight. To level the playing field, Sarah needed professional help. That afternoon, she visited a local lawyer named James Carter, known for his expertise in property disputes. His office was modest, a small room cluttered with books, files, and a desk covered in papers, but his reputation spoke volumes. When Sarah explained her situation and showed him the evidence she'd collected, James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "This is quite the case you've got here," he said, flipping through the documents. "It's not every day someone walks in claiming they own the land under an HOA headquarters." Sarah nodded. "I'm not doing this out of spite," she said earnestly. "I just want them to leave me alone and admit they made a mistake. This is my home, and I'm not giving it up without a fight." James agreed to take on her case, impressed by both the strength of her evidence and her unwavering resolve. Together they drafted a formal response to the HOA, outlining the facts in clear, concise language. The letter explained that Sarah's land had been improperly included in Pine Ridge Estate's development plans and demanded that the HOA cease all attempts to interfere with her property. It ended with a bold statement. "Furthermore, we must inform you that your main office is located on land legally owned by Ms. Thompson." When the letter arrived at the HOA offices, chaos erupted behind closed doors. Members convened emergency meetings, frantically discussing how they could have missed such a critical detail. Some argued that settling quietly was the best option, while others insisted on fighting back, convinced Sarah must be bluffing. Richard Langley, ever the stubborn leader, refused to back down. He ordered another round of surveys, determined to prove once and for all that Sarah was wrong. Meanwhile, word of the dispute began spreading throughout Pine Ridge Estates. Neighbors whispered about the standoff, debating whose side to take. Some sympathized with Sarah, admiring her courage and tenacity. Others sided with the HOA, believing that rules were rules and exceptions shouldn't be made. Tension simmered beneath the surface, turning the once idyllic community into a powder keg waiting to explode. Back at the ranch, Sarah prepared for whatever came next. She hired additional security to patrol her property, ensuring no one trespassed without permission. She also reached out to local media outlets, sharing her story in hopes of garnering public support. Reporters flocked to the area, eager to cover the unusual feud between a lone rancher and a powerful HOA. Cameras captured images of Sarah riding her horse across her fields, framed against the backdrop of rolling hills and endless skies. Despite the mounting pressure, Sarah remained steadfast. She spent her days tending to her animals, planting crops, and keeping watch over her land. At night, she'd sit on her porch, staring at the stars and reflecting on how far she'd come. This fight wasn't just about protecting her ranch, it was about preserving her identity, her heritage, and the values her family had instilled in her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and challenges, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers had begun rallying around her, offering words of encouragement and pledging their support. With each passing day, Sarah grew stronger, more determined, and more resolute. The HOA may have underestimated her, but they were about to learn a valuable lesson. Never mess with a woman who knows her worth and owns the ground you're standing on. The days following Sarah's formal response to the HOA were anything but quiet. Pine Ridge Estates, once a serene and orderly community, became a hotbed of tension and gossip. The HOA members were in turmoil, scrambling to figure out how they had overlooked such a monumental error. Richard Langley, their president, was particularly livid. He had built his reputation on being in control, on making decisions that kept Pine Ridge Estates running smoothly. But now he found himself at the center of a mess he couldn't easily fix. Sarah, on the other hand, was ready for whatever came next. She had anticipated that the HOA wouldn't back down without a fight, and she wasn't wrong. One crisp morning, as Sarah saddled her horse to check on the cattle grazing near the edge of her property, she spotted a group of strangers walking around with tripods, measuring tapes, and clipboards. Surveyors. They were staking out markers and jotting down notes, clearly up to something. Her stomach churned with anger. "What are you doing on my land?" she called out, riding closer. The surveyors turned to face her, looking startled but unapologetic. "We're here on behalf of the HOA," one of them replied matter-of-factly. "We're reassessing the boundaries." Sarah dismounted her horse, her boots crunching against the dry earth as she approached them. "You don't have permission to be here," she said firmly. "This is private property." The lead surveyor shrugged, attempting to brush her off. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. If you've got an issue, take it up with the HOA." Sarah clenched her fists, fighting the urge to lose her temper. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. Within 20 minutes, a deputy arrived at the scene. After hearing Sarah's explanation and speaking briefly with the surveyors, the deputy informed them that they needed explicit authorization from the property owner to conduct any work on private land. "You'll need to leave," the deputy told the surveyors, his tone leaving no room for argument. The men grumbled but eventually packed up their equipment and left. As they drove away in their white van, Sarah felt a small sense of victory, but she knew this was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to let this go quietly, and sure enough, later that evening, Sarah received another letter. This time, it was more aggressive, accusing her of obstructing their efforts and threatening further legal action if she continued to interfere. Word of the escalating conflict spread quickly through Pine Ridge Estates. Neighbors who had previously dismissed Sarah as some distant rancher now found themselves drawn into the drama. Some residents sympathized with her plight, especially those who had moved to the area seeking peace and didn't appreciate the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Others, however, remained staunchly loyal to the organization, believing that rules were rules and exceptions shouldn't be made, even if it meant evicting someone from their own land. Tensions boiled over during a heated HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse. Dozens of residents packed the room, eager to voice their opinions. Richard Langley stood at the front trying to maintain order as people shouted over one another. "Enough!" he barked, slamming his fist on the podium. "We can't afford to look weak here. If we give in to Miss Thompson, what message does that send? That anyone can ignore our regulations?" But not everyone agreed. A woman named Margaret Hayes, who lived 2 streets away from Sarah's ranch, spoke up. "Maybe we should listen to her side of the story before jumping to conclusions," she suggested. "From what I've heard, she has legitimate claims." Richard shot her a glare. "Legitimate or not, this isn't about feelings, it's about enforcing the law." The debate raged on, dividing the room into factions. By the end of the meeting, no clear resolution had been reached. Instead, Richard doubled down on his plan to fight Sarah in court, convinced that overwhelming her with legal fees would force her to surrender. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for battle. With James Carter by her side, she filed a countersuit against the HOA, accusing them of trespassing, harassment, and slander. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge Estates, drawing even more attention to the case. Local newspapers picked up the story, dubbing it "The Rancher versus the Subdivision." Reporters camped outside Sarah's ranch, snapping photos and conducting interviews. Television crews set up cameras along the fence line, capturing footage of Sarah tending to her animals and working in her garden. For Sarah, the sudden media frenzy was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought much-needed visibility to her cause. People across the country began following her story, sending messages of support and donations to help cover her legal expenses. On the other hand, the constant scrutiny made life on the ranch feel less peaceful. Strangers showed up uninvited, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman taking on the HOA. Some offered encouragement. Others hurled insults, calling her stubborn or unreasonable. Despite the chaos, Sarah refused to let it get to her. She spent her mornings caring for her livestock, afternoons reviewing documents with James, and evenings sitting on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. During these quiet moments, she reminded herself why she was fighting, not just for her land, but for justice. As the trial date approached, tensions reached a boiling point. The HOA hired a high-powered attorney to represent them, determined to crush Sarah's case. Their lawyer argued that regardless of historical records, the subdivision's existence relied on maintaining its current boundaries, allowing Sarah to retain ownership of her land, and worse, the parcel beneath their office, would destabilize the entire community. But Sarah's team wasn't backing down. James presented a mountain of evidence proving her family's long-standing ownership of the ranch. He highlighted the HOA's negligence in failing to verify property lines before building their development. And then came the bombshell, the map showing that the HOA's main office sat squarely on Sarah's land. When the judge saw the map, he paused mid-hearing, visibly stunned. "Are you telling me," he asked Richard Langley, "that your organization has been operating out of a building constructed on land you don't legally own?" Richard squirmed in his seat, unable to deny it. "We were unaware," he stammered. It was an honest mistake. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Sarah sat quietly, her expression calm but triumphant. For months she had been painted as the villain, the troublemaker standing in the way of progress. Now the truth was undeniable. The HOA had overstepped, and Sarah was the rightful owner of the land. The judge wasted no time issuing an injunction, halting all HOA activities until the matter could be resolved. The ruling sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge Estates. Residents who had doubted Sarah's claims began to see her in a new light. Even some of the HOA board members privately admitted they had misjudged her. For Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. While she was relieved to finally have the law on her side, she couldn't help but feel sad about the rift the dispute had caused. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into a full-blown feud, pitting neighbor against neighbor, and tearing apart a once close-knit community. Still, Sarah refused to give up hope. As she rode her horse across her fields that evening, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows across the land, she reminded herself of why she had fought so hard. This wasn't just her home, it was her legacy. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would continue to protect it with everything she had. The trial between Sarah Thompson and the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association became the talk of the town, and beyond. What had started as a quiet dispute over property lines had blown up into a full-blown legal spectacle, drawing reporters, curious onlookers, and even national attention. For weeks leading up to the trial, both sides prepared their cases meticulously. The HOA spared no expense, hiring a team of high-profile lawyers who specialized in real estate law. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly alongside James Carter, her attorney, poring over documents, rehearsing testimonies, and strategizing every possible angle. On the day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks in hand, while residents of Pine Ridge Estates filled the benches, eager to see how this David and Goliath story would unfold. Sarah arrived dressed simply but confidently, her cowboy boots clicking against the tiled floor as she walked to her seat. Across the aisle sat Richard Langley and his entourage of attorneys, their polished suits and stern expressions radiating authority. As the proceedings began, the atmosphere grew tense. The HOA's lawyer opened with a bold argument, attempting to paint Sarah as an outsider, disrupting the harmony of Pine Ridge Estates. This community has thrived because of strict adherence to rules designed to protect property values and quality of life, he declared. Ms. Thompson's refusal to comply threatens the very foundation of our neighborhood. When it was James Carter's turn to speak, he wasted no time dismantling the HOA's narrative. Calmly and methodically, he presented decades' worth of evidence proving Sarah's ownership of the land. He showed maps, deeds, tax records, and letters from historians, all pointing to one undeniable truth. Sarah's family had owned the ranch long before Pine Ridge Estates existed. But the real showstopper came when James unveiled the map showing that the HOA's main office sat on Sarah's property. The room fell silent as the judge examined the document. Even Richard Langley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for such a damning revelation. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was sharp and incredulous. "Mr. Langley," he said, addressing the HOA president directly, "are you telling me your organization built its headquarters on land it does not legally own?" Richard hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Your Honor," he stammered, "this is an oversight, a mistake made in good faith." "Good faith?" the judge echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Building an entire office complex on someone else's property hardly qualifies as a minor error." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Sarah allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. Over the next several hours, James continued to dismantle the HOA's arguments, exposing their negligence and lack of due diligence. Witnesses testified about the HOA's aggressive tactics, including the unauthorized surveys and threats of eviction. By the end of the day, it was clear which side held the moral and legal high ground. The verdict came quickly. The judge ruled unequivocally in Sarah's favor, ordering the HOA to vacate the parcel of land beneath their office immediately. Furthermore, he imposed hefty fines for trespassing and harassment, along with a public apology to Sarah. The ruling sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge Estates. Residents who had once dismissed Sarah as a troublemaker now saw her as a symbol of resilience and justice. Some even approached her outside the courthouse offering apologies and words of support. But the fallout wasn't limited to the HOA. Internally, the organization imploded. Board members turned on each other, blaming one another for the catastrophic blunder. Richard Langley resigned in disgrace, his reputation in tatters. The HOA scrambled to find temporary office space elsewhere, their operations grinding to a halt as they dealt with the financial and logistical fallout of the lawsuit. For Sarah, the victory felt bittersweet. While she was relieved to have proven her case, she couldn't ignore the toll the conflict had taken on her and on the community. Her peaceful ranch had become the epicenter of a media circus, with strangers constantly showing up uninvited and cameras flashing at all hours. She missed the simplicity of her old life, when her biggest concern was whether the rain would come in time for planting season. Still, Sarah refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she focused on healing and moving forward. In the weeks following the trial, she reached out to some of her neighbors, inviting them to visit the ranch and learn more about her way of life. To her surprise, many accepted. They came bearing gifts, homemade pies, jars of jam, and heartfelt apologies, and left with a newfound appreciation for the woman who had stood her ground against impossible odds. One visitor, a young mother named Emily Parker, struck up a particularly meaningful friendship with Sarah. Emily confessed that she had initially sided with the HOA, believing Sarah to be unreasonable. "But seeing you fight for what's right changed my perspective," she admitted during one of their conversations. "You reminded me that standing up for yourself doesn't make you difficult, it makes you brave." Sarah smiled, touched by Emily's words. "It's not about being brave," she replied. "It's about doing what needs to be done. My family worked too hard for this land to let anyone take it away." As the dust settled, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything she had endured. The battle with the HOA had tested her in ways she never imagined, forcing her to confront doubt, fear, and anger. But it had also revealed her strength and determination. More importantly, it had shown her the power of standing firm in her convictions, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. With the legal battle behind her, Sarah turned her attention back to the ranch. She repaired fences damaged during the surveyor's visits, replanted crops trampled by trespassers, and spent long days riding her horse across the fields she loved so dearly. Life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a dramatic chapter. Yet something had shifted within Sarah. She realized that her fight wasn't just about protecting her own land. It was about advocating for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Inspired by her experience, she began speaking at local events, sharing her story and offering advice to those facing property disputes. She also partnered with organizations dedicated to preserving rural heritage, using her platform to raise awareness about the importance of respecting land rights. One evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she knew she had the strength to face whatever challenges came her way. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they served as a reminder of how far she had come and how much she had accomplished. In the distance, the faint sound of crickets chirped, blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a melody Sarah had heard countless times before, but tonight, it carried a new meaning. It was the sound of peace, the kind earned through perseverance, courage, and unwavering belief in oneself. In the months that followed the trial, life in Pine Ridge Estates began to change in unexpected ways. The HOA, once a symbol of order and authority, found itself struggling to regain trust within the community. Many residents who had blindly supported the organization now questioned its motives and methods. Board meetings, once attended by only a handful of people, were suddenly packed with homeowners eager to voice their concerns. Some demanded transparency, others called for reforms. The HOA's leadership team, hastily assembled after Richard Langley's resignation, worked tirelessly to rebuild the organization from the ground up. For Sarah Thompson, the aftermath of the trial brought both challenges and opportunities. While she was relieved to have her land and her rights restored, she couldn't ignore the lingering tension between herself and some of her neighbors. Though many had come around to support her, a small faction of Pine Ridge Estates residents still resented her victory. They viewed her as an outsider who had disrupted their carefully curated world. But Sarah refused to let negativity define her relationship with the community. Instead, she chose compassion over resentment, extending olive branches wherever possible. One way she did this was by hosting open days at her ranch. Every Saturday morning, she welcomed visitors to explore her property, meet her animals, and learn about the history of the land. She set up picnic tables under the shade of ancient oak trees, serving lemonade and homemade cookies baked by her elderly neighbor, Margaret Hayes. Families from Pine Ridge Estates brought their children, who giggled as they fed carrots to the horses and chased chickens around the barnyard. For many, it was their first glimpse into a lifestyle vastly different from their own, and they left with a newfound appreciation for Sarah and her way of life. These gatherings also gave Sarah a chance to share her story on a more personal level. Sitting on hay bales or leaning against fence posts, she spoke candidly about the challenges she had faced and the lessons she had learned along the way. "This fight wasn't just about my land," she told one group during a particularly heartfelt moment. "It was about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. I hope my story reminds you that no matter how big the obstacle, you can overcome it if you stay true to yourself." Her words resonated deeply with those who heard them. Over time, Sarah became something of a local legend, a symbol of resilience and integrity. People began seeking her advice not just on property disputes but on all kinds of issues, from family conflicts to career dilemmas. She listened patiently, offering wisdom gained through years of hard work and perseverance. In return, they offered her friendship, support, and gratitude. But Sarah didn't stop there. Inspired by her experience, she decided to take her advocacy beyond Pine Ridge Estates. She partnered with organizations dedicated to protecting rural landowners' rights, traveling to conferences and workshops to speak about her journey. Her presentations were always well received, blending humor, humility, and a fierce determination that left audiences inspired. One attendee, a young farmer named Jake, approached her after a talk in Austin. "Your story gives me hope," he said earnestly. "I've been fighting to keep my family's farm from being sold off for development. Hearing you tell your story makes me believe I can win too." Sarah smiled warmly. "You absolutely can," she replied. "Just remember, don't let anyone make you doubt what's yours. Stand your ground and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it." As her reputation grew, so did her influence. Local politicians began consulting her on land use policies, recognizing her unique perspective as someone who had fought and won, a battle against powerful interests. Journalists profiled her in magazines and newspapers, dubbing her the rancher who took down the HOA. Despite the attention, Sarah remained grounded, never losing sight of the values that had guided her throughout her ordeal. Back at the ranch, Sarah continued to live the simple, fulfilling life she had always cherished. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. Days were spent tending to her animals, planting crops, and repairing fences. Evenings ended with quiet reflection, often accompanied by the soft strumming of her guitar as she sang old folk songs passed down through generations. Yet, even in these peaceful moments, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how much her life had changed. What had once been a solitary existence had transformed into a rich tapestry of connections, with her neighbors, her community, and strangers across the country who had been touched by her story. She realized that while the legal battle had tested her limits, it had also opened doors she never imagined. One day, as she rode her horse along the edge of her property, she noticed a group of Pine Ridge Estates residents planting trees near the boundary line. It was part of a new initiative to beautify the area and promote unity between the subdivision and surrounding lands. When they saw Sarah approaching, they waved enthusiastically, inviting her to join them. "I thought you might like to pick out a tree," one of the women said with a smile. "We figured it could be a symbol of peace and maybe a little bit of thanks." Touched by the gesture, Sarah dismounted her horse and walked over to examine the saplings. After careful consideration, she chose a sturdy oak, its roots wrapped tightly in burlap. Together, they dug a hole and planted it, patting the soil firmly around the base. As they stood back to admire their handiwork, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This tree, she thought, would grow alongside the relationships she had nurtured over the past year, a living reminder of how far everyone had come. Years later, when the oak had grown tall and strong, Sarah often brought visitors to see it. By then, the feud with the HOA was nothing more than a distant memory, recounted with laughter rather than bitterness. Pine Ridge Estates had evolved into a thriving, inclusive community where differences were celebrated rather than feared. And Sarah? She remained exactly who she had always been, a proud rancher, a loving neighbor, and a steadfast advocate for justice. On sunny afternoons, as she sat on her porch watching the world go by, Sarah would sometimes catch sight of Richard, Langley driving past in his sleek car. He always waved sheepishly, a silent acknowledgement of the lessons he had learned, and perhaps a hint of regret for the role he had played in the conflict. Each time Sarah returned the wave with a warm smile, choosing forgiveness over grudges. Her journey had taught her many things, but above all, it had reinforced her belief in the power of perseverance, kindness, and truth. Life on the ranch wasn't perfect. It never had been, but it was hers. And as long as she drew breath, she vowed to protect it, cherish it, and share its beauty with anyone willing to listen. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't just about winning. They're about finding peace, building bridges, and proving that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can shine brighter than the sun setting over the hills.